So we're really happy to have Sofia Celi here, and she will talk about how private is secure messaging. Sophia currently works at Cloudflare. She is one of the main developer of OTR v4, or the main developer. And she's organizing a lot of events in the context of messaging and privacy in messaging. So yeah, we're happy to have her. And Sophia, floor is yours.
Thank you, Andreas. I'm going to try to share my screen and hopefully not fail. Okay, Zoom says that is sharing, so I believe on Zoom. Okay, thank you, Andreas. Okay, so hi everybody. Thank you very much, Andreas, for allowing me to give this lecture. And as Andreas said, the idea of this lecture was basically to talk about secure messaging. What does a secure messaging mean? And if there's a space for privacy properties and secure messaging, or by definition, secure messaging also implies privacy. And I am Sofia, and just in case you've never seen me, this is myself. And a little bit of information, as Andrea said, I have worked mainly in the OTR protocol, and nowadays I mainly have been doing post-quantum algorithms and how they relate to network protocols, and more recently, an analysis of themselves from a formal verification, implementation and analysis perspective. If you want to learn more, that's the website. So let's begin directly. So what is the agenda and what is the purpose of this talk in itself? As I say, one of the purposes of this talk is actually to talk about what it means to have a system that is deemed to be secure, to have certain security measures in the way that they handle the messaging. And this is very important to talk nowadays because, as you have seen currently in the news, there's a lot of instances in which there's a lot of articles, there's a lot of places where there is being said that secure messaging is being attacked because there's an increase of surveillance, because there's a break on the systems, because more other actors want to have access to the contents of secure communications. So it is important to really start talking about secure communication and secure messaging in general. But in order to start talking about secure messaging, one has to understand what indeed one does means when they're talking about secure messaging, and what kind of specific properties does secure messaging have, and if those properties only relate to security properties or they also relate to privacy properties. And then further on this presentation, I will also be talking about the current state of certain instances in which certain entities have been trying to gather, to get into secure messaging, to break secure messaging, and what does this has meant about the definition of secure messaging, about how we actually implement and actually analyze and actually define secure messaging in general. So basically, just to give you a little bit of an overview of what we will be seeing today. So the question is, what is secure messaging? And this is a really difficult question to answer because in a lot of places that you will read from the theory, you will read one thing, from the news or from articles, you will read another thing. And then when you're talking with someone else, maybe you will get another definition. And maybe when you're reading a body of standardization and I see you will read another definition. So in general, what can say is that there's not a good, precise final definition of what secure messaging is. And if we want to start tackling into this question, the first thing that we can do is that we can divide this general question into two. The first one is what is security, and the second one, basically, what is messaging. And in general, the big set that in which messaging is inside of is the set of communication. The latter question is the one that is more easier to be answered to, because we do know what is messaging. If we follow even the theory of communication and we follow, for example, the work of someone as Jacobson, we know that communication is basically this mechanism by which a participant wants to send a message to another participant over a specific channel and using a specific code, meaning it's going to be encoded in a certain specific kind of way. And that is part of the communication phase. And whatever it is that we're going to be transmitted to whomever we want to be transmitting is this message that is the one that we are deeming that should be secured. And I put an asterisk in that, in the sense that maybe it's not only the message that we want to make it secure, but maybe other parts of the communication itself that we should indeed make them secure. But in general, when people think about secure messaging, they focus on the message itself. What is missing in this question and what is missing in the title of this presentation is that it's going to be focusing in the digital world, because obviously there's such a thing as secure communication in the non-digital world. And it was interesting to me some days ago when I was doing these slides to realize that when we talk about secure communication, not in the context of digital means, but rather in the context of non-digital means, meaning casual conversations we have with colleagues or with friends, we don't often call them secure conversations. We call them private conversations because we have this notion that, oh, this conversation has to be private or has to be secret, and we don't call them secure. Perhaps in the digital world, we call them secure because it comes from the notion at the beginning that we should only protect sensitive information that gets sent through digital means, meaning we should only protect passwords or credit card information or keys. And I hope you're not sending really keys, but maybe that's kind of sensitive information that instead of deeming it to be private, we should make it safe, we should make it secure. And maybe that is why in the digital world, we tend to think about not private messaging as we do in the non-digital world, but rather think about it as secure messaging. So in order to answer the first sub-question that I have put it in here of what is security, this is basically the purpose of the next slide, of basically what is this notion of security. If you see most of the secure messaging protocols that exist out there, they aim to give these three properties mostly with a subset of the different properties in itself. So the first property that they aim to give is certain kind of data confidentiality, then data integrity, and finally authentication. It is worth noting that the two properties that I have listed here, data confidentiality and integrity, are only related to the message itself. So most of the times when you're reading secure messaging protocols, they will be only talking about securing the message itself and not any other additional data that gets created because of the communication process, not protecting any kind of metadata, any kind of extra data that gets generated. It's worth noting also on the third subproperty that I listed here, which is the one of authentication, that this is an explicit authentication, most of the times achieved by the usage of digital signatures, in the sense that it's not only verified, it's not only validated by the intended participant of a conversation, but indeed can be validated by anybody else who has indeed access to this proof and can be validated by anybody else. In the future, in other slides, we will see if this is indeed something that diminishes privacy or if it doesn't really diminish privacy. Most of the times when one reads about secure messaging, one oftentimes hear that is very related to end-to-end encryption, and in many places it's actually used interchangeably. And this is again because there's not like a complete definition of what secure messaging is, and also there's not a complete formal definition of what end-to-end encryption is. Right now, there's two proposals at the IETF by Mallory Nodell and myself and other people, and there's also a proposal by Alec Moffett to actually define what end-to-end encryption actually means. And the most important question when one is thinking about end-to-end encryption is what actually means when one says end, meaning that the conversation has to be, the messages should be encrypted until it reaches the service provider, or should it reaches the end user, or it reaches the end user's devices, and actually figuring out what's the end, where should this protection of the message should end is an open question still. And that's what we're trying to actively standardize nowadays. So let's look at the first set of properties, which is the property of confidentiality. And the most common definition for this is the definition that messages, meaning the contents of the conversation, what the most important part of the conversation that you want to send to a participant, are only going to be read, and in parentheses here, decrypted, by the intended participants who are part of this conversation. This notion works very well because then you actually know what it is that you're trying to protect. You're trying to protect the message itself, and you know that the action that you want to achieve is that only the intended participants are able to decrypt the message itself. But it doesn't work when one is thinking about, like, for example, what happens if you want to add another participant into this conversation. So in this notion, for example, there's like a closure on it, in the sense that you always have to think about what intended participants are going to be part of your conversation. And if you later want to add another one, then what you will have to do is kind of forget a previous state of the conversation, refresh a ceremony of authentication, and enter a new state of a conversation in order to add another participant. So it's kind of a little bit too too much of, it doesn't provide any kind of dynamic way to add any kind of participant to a conversation. So I leave it static in that way. The other thing that when we think about confidentiality more now in regards to how secure messaging is actually applied in the real world, if it's indeed this conversation are only intended to be read by any participants or only by human participants. Because what happens in the actual deployability of most of the secure messaging protocols is that the intended participant is indeed the intended friend who you are supposed to be talking to, but also it could be the bot that is installed because it's useful to the system that is providing you this service, because it's an easy way for report any kind of harmful content. So should this notion be restricted into only human participants that you are intended to communicate with, and not any kind of bot or any kind of machine that might be also, without you realizing, reading the content of the conversation itself? And of course, the last question when you're looking at this definition is actually what does it mean by read? And this is why I added in parentheses the notion of decrypted, because if someone manages to decrypt to the original message, then you know that this is what was indeed intended to be sent. Of course, inside of this notion of confidentiality, there's other sub-properties that come from it, that at the beginning, when secure messaging protocols were first proposed, when, for example, TLS was deemed as one of the first secure messaging protocols when it was called SSL, and then you have GPG, and eventually came OTI, which is the off-the-record messaging protocol, and say maybe this notion of confidentiality is not enough, because this notion of confidentiality means that if an attacker is able to gather the key, then they will also be able to decrypt any past messages that were sent, because it's not protecting any past messages. And then it came this notion of forward secrecy, which basically means that any key that you are using to encrypt a message is unique to that message, and it cannot be used to decrypt any of the past messages that you get sent. And in this way, the notion of confidentiality gets expanded a little bit more to this notion of also including that if for whatever reason an adversary is able to get one of the keys with which it will be able to decrypt a message, then they will not be able to decrypt any of the past messages. The same with the notion of post-compromise security, and this notion came further down the line. It was one of the notions that was mostly pushed forward by the Signal protocol. And basically the idea is that the conversation in the past is not only that the conversation in the past should be protected, but also the conversation in the future, meaning if an attacker for whatever reason manages to get access to a key of a message, then they will not be able to decrypt or to read any future messages that get sent. And again, in this way, the notion of confidentiality gets a little bit more further expanded into also this future thinking. Okay, so that is basically, if you see most of the secure messaging protocols, at least at the beginning, those are the properties that they were always trying to target, that there are certain forms of that data confidentiality that eventually were expanded to this notion of forward secrecy and post-compromise security. There's this notion of having that integrity, and then this notion of having an authentication that can be verified by anyone else, but most of the times it's only intended to be verified by the participants in the conversation. And then there was this question, which is more intertwined into the actual reality and how secure messaging is used. In the sense of now, we have been protecting the contents of the conversation. Is there a place now for actual metadata protection, for example? The reason why is because nowadays there's a rise of certain entities to asking for users to surrender the metadata, or asking for certain applications to surrender the metadata, because certain entities have realized that there's a lot of content that they can infer from the metadata that is a consequence of the communication process itself. The same way for authentication, as I say at the beginning, most of the time security messaging protocols achieve a form of authentication that can be verified by anyone, and not only for the intended participants in the conversation. So maybe there should be another form of authentication in which this proof of authentication can only be verified by the intended participant and cannot be further transmitted to anybody outside of this participant group. And this is the property that is often called as deniability, and it has a lot of controversy and a lot of thoughts around it. So we'll touch that in just a few minutes. And the latest one is the property of anonymity, that even if I want to send a message, maybe I should not disclose my identity. And this is when secure messaging also gets divided into what is secure messaging in a text-based chat, meaning in the chats, and if secure messaging should also apply, for example, on communications that we have with web servers when we are actually fetching for a website or when we are browsing. Or are those also forms of secure communication, or that secure communication should only apply to text-based chats and these kind of informal communications that we have? Most of the aims that we have had for anonymity, to put it in the world out there, has been on actually securing more at the network level rather than at the chat text-based level. There has been some instances, there's some protocols that Ricochet, there's right now one effort by Open Privacy to create an anonymous chat, which is really amazing. There are some efforts, but it hasn't been pushed as much as other privacy properties have. So let's talk about this other form of authentication that I was talking about, in which instead of having a digital signature that anybody can actually verify and check that indeed you are the one who authenticated this message into this conversation, there's this other form of authentication, which is the one that only the intended participants receives this proof of authentication, and they cannot transmit this proof of authentication to anybody else. It stays with them and it dies with them. What are the types of deniability? At the beginning in the literature, you will see that it was first referred as message and participation deniability. But nowadays, if you read the literature, the types of deniability are more often defined as online and offline deniability. So basically, what is this online and offline deniability? Offline is the easiest ones to understand. When talking about deniability, basically means that after the conversation has happened, this proof of authentication should not be transmittable. You should not be able to transmit it to anybody else. It only stays with the intended participants. And the other notion, which is the notion for online deniability, is that during the conversation, there should not also be a way to generate a proof of authentication that can be transmitted to a third party. Even if actively someone is trying to do a key compromise impersonation attack during the conversation execution, they should not be able to provide you with a proof of authentication that can be transmitted to a third party. And in this point, I would like to talk a little bit about why deniability sometimes is considered this controversial property. And it's because one of the things that you can actually achieve if you use some kind of authentication that can be verified by anyone else, it means that anybody that manages to break a secure messaging system can also further take those messages and show indeed that they were authored by the specific participant, which can create a big proof of authorship that can be presented in court cases and can be used to say, yes, indeed, this is the person who said this in this specific conversation. It has not really happened, and there's not much of an instance on this actually being used. It doesn't mean that maybe it will not be happening in the future, but it has not been happening so far. One of the things about deniability, one of the reasons why, for example, you will not be wanting to use deniability and rather provide this proof of authentication that can be verified by anyone else is, for example, in the case that many activists are targeted by people who are trying to impersonate a friend that they know so they can gather information about the activities that right now they are doing. And in the way, if you are using a proof of authentication that only ends with the participant himself, there's no other way that you can actually verify this authenticity. But if you have something like as an explicit proof of authentication by using a digital signature, maybe then you can use some kind of certificate or chain of trust or somehow a way to attest that indeed this participant is the one that you are intending to speak to. There's other ways to achieve this, and this is one of the reasons, for example, that security has these verification mechanisms of authentication by usage of the safety number, or the OTR protocol had the Socialist Millionaire Protocol to achieve this specific case. So you know that you are indeed talking to the correct person that you're supposed to be talking to. Okay, and now I'm just going to be a little bit more into actually what does it mean secure messaging in the current world, and what's the state of the current world, and why should we care about secure messaging, and why does it matter to actually have these privacy properties to be part of the secure messaging sphere or the secure messaging thinking. So as you already know, I already said in the previous slide, there's such a thing as metadata protection. And in this talk, I also wanted to touch upon not only the legal framework or maybe the global north countries, because we always hear about them, but also of other countries of around the world, because it's also interesting to think about the different other regions that exist in the world and what kind of limitations or what kind of problems do they actually have. So in the case of Latin America, most of Latin American countries have certain flavor of privacy laws. Ecuador has one, Colombia has one, Brazil, Argentina, and Chile has privacy laws. Most of them has kind of flavor that most of the privacy laws are inspired by GDPR and inspired by the European Union effort to create these privacy laws. And most of them, as I said, what they want to do is that they want to protect the contents of the communication itself, and they heavily enforce the protection of these, but they most of the times don't care about metadata protection. And in most of the framework of these laws, you will see that sometimes they refer as metadata and subscriber data. In my mind, they basically are the same, and from a theory perspective, probably the same, but from a legal perspective, they often divide them into two. But just think of them as what we think usually as metadata. There's really little protection for the metadata of the conversation itself in the privacy laws of different parts of the world. And the reason why is because they follow the tradition of actually thinking that secure messaging should be the same as the postal service. And in the postal service, most of the time, the contents of the letters should not be open and should not be known and like a postal service person who is doing the job should not be opening and reading the contents of the letter, but this person has indeed access to the envelope, has indeed access to see from who in this address, to who is going to, from which locations, which countries does this letter has traveled upon, and it has got access to all of these extra metadata. And the same, they say, then the same should apply for digital communications, that no one should be able to read the contents of the conversation, but anybody will be able to see the extra metadata added to it. But in general, this is not enough, because if you see the legal framework of Latin America, at least the legal framework that was used in the past, not recently, because now we actually have some kind of flavor of privacy laws, but the legal framework prior to it, most of the times only refer to telecommunications or to the postal services, and there was not actually some laws regarding digital communications, which means that for a really long time, any entity who wanted to record contents or metadata associated with it was able to do so. So this was indeed a problem. Another thing that we have found out, and is recently this has been rising all over through the years, is that now we spend most of the time doing digital conversations over the internet, and it's much more bigger than the postal services. So the amount of data that you can actually recollect from this metadata is way bigger than what the postal services might be able to do. So it's not the comparison, why I'm saying this is that the comparison is maybe not really natural. If you want to learn more about the privacy laws in Latin America, there's this really interesting report by the EFF and the EFF and other actors about what the state of them are in Latin America. And you can read them here in the slide, is the link. In the terms of authentication, because why I'm putting this slide here is because most of the times when we think about secure messaging, we think about attacks that break indeed the contents of the conversation. We think of adversaries who want to go and actually read the contents of this conversation, but there's other flavors of attack that maybe we should also be taking into account. An attack to authentication is itself, for example, what happens to a lot of activists all over the world, that people will try to impersonate to them by pretending to be a person and then trying to get access to the conversation or trying to convince them to share certain kind of information with them. Or what will happen is that instead of impersonating, they will keep creating a fake account that most of the times is a woman and has certain religious connotations and has like a lot of family, friends, contacts, and therefore the person is willing to talk to because it looks like a safe person, but in reality it's just a fake account that was created in order to gather information, and it's either in order to gather information or to make them to click a link so malware can be installed. So this I will see there is two kinds of attacks: in an attack to authentication itself, and by a successful impersonation, then what happens is that maybe more words will be installed, and then the contents of the conversation, any past and future contents of any conversation, will be able to be decrypted and read, because now you have an active adversary sitting on the device reading all of the contents of the conversation. And this happens all over the world to a lot of activists all over the world. I just wanted to highlight this as actually something that happens. Okay, so this is basically, I just gave you a little bit of two examples of what happens in the real world nowadays. And now I wanted to tell more in detail what's the state of the world and where secure messaging, or the definition that we have currently for secure messaging, seems to be limited to what we actually see in the world. What about if we actually try to add all of these notions by looking at example cases and see if indeed the previous notion of secure messaging indeed fits, and if it doesn't fit, maybe there's other open question that we should be thinking about it to add to that definition itself. And why should we care now in the real world? Because the state of surveillance has always been increasing. Every day there's more and more entities who want to have access to the contents of conversation and to the metadata that is associated with it. This is a new, bigger form of surveillance, because of course you could do this by the radio communications, but it's much more bigger in the digital world. And also because new actors are trying to get access to these contents of the communication. And they're not only trying to get access to the contents, but sometimes also infer patterns of behavior from the persons by, for example, analyzing the metadata, or sometimes they want to learn about the personality of someone by, again, analyzing the metadata. And these are indeed certain kinds of attacks that get carried. So let's see some example cases. So for example, let's see one specific country. Let's see what's the state of privacy laws in Brazil. So in Brazil, the privacy law was indeed enacted in 2018. And it's kind of working, but not that much enforced. It is worth noting, furthermore, that in the Brazilian 1988 federal constitution, there's a protection of free expression, but anonymity is really stated as so. Anonymity is forbidden, but certain kind of privacy of communications is allowed. So your communication is allowed to be private, but if you're trying to make it anonymous, you probably are going to go against the constitution itself in Brazil. And again, what happens with this notion in the Brazilian law, at least, is that it seems to be limited to data that is in transit, meaning as part of the communication itself, meaning when it's actually traveling through the network protocol or through the network itself. But most of these privacy laws actually have a lot of holes when it actually means for data retention, meaning, I don't know, it actually arrived into the device or actually arrived into the service provider. Does this mean that this data is going to be sitting there forever, and sometime in the future you will find another attack and be able to decrypt it, and you should not even disclose this to the user because now it's in your servers and you're good to go? Does that mean that secure messaging is only about protecting the message while it's in transit, and once it reaches whatever end it reaches and it's stored, it's not longer secure, or those security notions do not apply anymore? So this is something that maybe should be thought of when we're thinking about secure messaging, not only about the data in transit, but also what happens when it actually reaches a device, or what happens when it actually reaches a service provider or a server somewhere, or somewhere where it will be staying for a longer period of time at rest. In the case of Brazil, again, in the case of Brazil as well, there has been many types of attacks actually to people, and they have tried to get into the communication of different groups. And the case specifically of Brazil, this has always happens with people who most of the time are climate activists who are fighting, for example, for a good regulation of the rainforest territory in Brazil, or who are fighting to actually have a place or a land where they can actually grow crops. And this, for example, is the case of the Movimiento Sem Terra. In this case, for example, there was this case that was reaching to the Inter-American Courts of Human Rights, and indeed Brazil lost against it because they illegally tried to intercept the communications of this group. And in most of the framework of Brazil, this is not really allowed, but most of the times it's carried out by law enforcement agencies or legal agencies, because they want to target these people who are protesting, and they actually want to know the contents of the conversation. More importantly also, well, this is also very important, but also additionally, is that when these people actually managed to get into the contents of the conversation, they didn't stop there. They didn't stop on only breaking into the content of the conversation, but they actually took the contents of those conversations and they leaked them to the press. So all of the conversation that happened in this case was actually leaked to the press, which also poses a question to secure messaging, but also to the privacy laws in general, that even if it is justified at some level because the legal framework really needs access to the conversations because a crime has been committed, then what should be the limitation of it? Should it mean that the entities get access to the secure messaging communication and they are only the ones to be supposed to having access, and is it okay for them to leaking that to the press or to leaking it to someone else, or giving access to other entities or publishing it somewhere? So if we indeed want to legalize that, in some specific cases there should be the breaking of secure messaging, what's actually the limitation on this break and who is going to be having access to this breaking of secure messaging? I will advocate that we shouldn't really be breaking secure messaging, but in the cases where certain legal frameworks does allow you, sometimes there's missing actually the notion of who is going to be having access to this broken communication and who is not. This also happens, for example, in Colombia. In Colombia, there has been many cases in which, for example, the software Esperanza or the software for analysis Puma or DePaul has been actually targeted to be used in the population in order to break the secure messaging that they are using. And this happened most of the time in Colombia, justified for the notion that they were trying to get terrorists, so they were actually part of the drug on trade, the war on drugs. So they actually wanted to get into the contents of those communications because they actually had a legal reason to do so. And this again poses the question that when we do the definition of secure messaging, should we allow that in the case of this crime, of a certain kind of crime, should we allow certain entities to have access to this communication, when they should have access to communication, when this access expired, who should have access, to what limits they should have access? All of these other open questions also get open when you open the first question. So I'm not saying that a lot of the framework does not have already all of these questions answered, but in some way or some another it has answered. There's something to be thinking when we think about secure messaging, that there will be maybe other frameworks in which we are not going to be achieving a perfect secure messaging system, because maybe the law is going to be restricting it in some way or allowing it to be broken in certain way. And this is another case that has been really recently in the media, and I wanted to just briefly touch upon it. And I just put this disclaimer over here because right now I'm going to be mentioning and talking about child sexual abuse. So if at some point this also triggers you, feel free to leave the talk, or feel free, if you are watching this as part of the recording, feel free to pause it and feel free to pause it and skip this slide over the video track, or however you want it, or just completely close it. It's completely fine for me, just as a disclaimer. So this is the popular case that right now we have been talking about quite a lot as part of the security community, as part of the cryptographic community, of this example of CSAM and Apple, who has been thought of as a way to actually break the secure messaging protections that Apple was indeed provided. And the idea is basically that in order to prevent child sexual abuse and the usage of child pornographic images that enhance child sexual abuse, we will be having to get and scan the images that get sent through certain services of Apple, and then reporting these to the law enforcement in one case, or reporting these into the family members in another case. And while this seems really great, and the motivation is really good in a place where it should be, because we all wanted to prevent as a society child sexual abuse. I'm actually a person who suffered from child sexual abuse since the age of 6 to the age of 8. And I know that it's something really important to do as society. I don't think that the part that we should do is just to break secure messaging in order to achieve this, because sometimes as society we think that technical solution will solve any kind of social problem, but most of the times maybe this is not the case. One of the reasons why, for example, in this case it will fail is a big amount of child sexual abuse cases actually happen are actually exercised by close family members or close family colleagues. So maybe are the ones who are going to be receiving the reports, and of course they're not going to be doing anything about it because they are indeed the perpetrators of this violence. So why should they be doing something about it? Another case that happens is that most of the time when these cases actually get reported to the law enforcement, they are not law enforcement, they are actually not brought forward into a trial or not brought forward into anything else, actually, because there's not enough resources in law enforcement to the amount of cases that actually get showed up. This is not only in the case of child sexual abuse cases that gets brought up to law enforcement agency or other kinds of agencies, but also in the case of sexual abuse in general, of women or of minorities. Sometimes those cases don't really move forward, even though maybe there will be all of the evidence and all of the needed process in order to move it forward. But it's just because sometimes law enforcement either don't believe that this case is indeed true, or because they don't have enough resources to do so. It's very well known that in society, we have underfunded social programs for precisely this, or law enforcement programs are underfunded to actually achieve a solution to all of these cases. So actually just scanning the images and providing this big amount of data into a law enforcement, yeah, in theory will be good, but maybe there's not even enough people power to enact upon once we receive this kind of data. Furthermore, I also work most of the times with survivors of gender-based violence that is enhanced by the usage of digital tools. And when we have indeed found many cases in which domestic abuser has taken illegal photos of a person without their consent, explicit sexual photos of them, and they have posted all over social media, or they have sent them through WhatsApp or through Facebook. And when we have actually sent these reports with all of the evidence stating that this indeed is something that was taken without the consent of this person, those reports most of the times get ignored. And I think it's because the amount of reports that get sent are too many to even act upon. Or maybe because we are reporting mostly from Latin America, so maybe that region has not the highest amount of importance as compared to other cases. I'm really just hypothesizing here, but then again, it shows that even when people actually report, they don't even need to break into secure messaging protections in order to see that this is indeed happening. And when you report, you still don't get any kind of solution to this. So maybe this is not the best solution. And a specific case that happened in Ecuador, for example, was the case of Juliana Campoverde, who indeed was eventually killed by her perpetrator. And all of the evidence that indeed show the amount of stalking and the amount of abuse that she was suffering was, of course, over chat channels that was secure chat channels. And eventually the people couldn't get into that evidence because indeed the perpetrator got access into the account itself and deleted everything. And even if when people actually sent asking for the report or any kind of backup, there was actually no response for this case. Eventually, the perpetrator of this case actually went to jail, which is one of the happy cases in which actually this happens. Okay, now from another point of view, I've listed some of the properties that I said will be worth to have in secure messaging, but sometimes something that I also think if it's indeed, this is something that at the end of the day gets reflected to the end user, and the end users realizes that these are the security properties that they need. This is the case, for example, of post-compromise security or forward secrecy. That yes, we have this, that means that an attacker, if he has access to the key, will not be able to decrypt any past messages or future messages, but does it really reflect in the user interface? Does it really reflect in the UI? Signal and the Wire application have this notion of, for example, having disappearing messages, which means that even if someone has access to the device itself and manages to read the messages, they will be gone because they disappeared. Is this the perfect solution where we're trying to actually take a security property and showcase it into the UI itself? I really don't know, because when I talk with activists, and I remember a specific conversation that I had with an activist in Hong Kong who told me that she doesn't set these disappearing messaging options because most of the times these are conversations with a loved one and she doesn't want to lose those messages. So if someone has access to their phone, they will still be able to see those messages, even if the protocol provides for secrecy, they will still be seeing them because she didn't want to lose them. So there's always this balance between achieving the security goal and then also achieving maybe other kind of users' needs. And maybe the intersection between all of these properties should be taken more into account. Like, for example, how does really deniability is understood by the end users? How does authentication is really understood by the end users, et cetera, et cetera. Or like, for example, if users really understand that only the contents of the conversations are the ones that are being protected and then the metadata is not. And if we protect metadata, how we are going to convey this into the end users. So what would be in the end, what is maybe the real secure messaging? Real secure messaging may be something that must prevent collecting or analyzing or interfering with or identifying any kind of communication. And I say any communication because I want to emphasize that it's not only about the content, but the metadata itself. And it also should prevent identifying because even if someone managed to break, maybe there should not be the case that it provides indeed a proof that is going to be used somehow in the future, that indeed you author a specific message. Or if it does, maybe that should have some legal limitation to it. And just wanted to tell you a last story. That's a very sad story. It's a story that happened in Latin America during the dictatorship of something that is called Los Archivos del Terror, the archives of terror. That is indeed a process of information gathering that a lot of law enforcement and military processes had in Latin America to actually gather as much as information as they wanted of people who they deemed were political dissidents and were communists mainly. And they wanted to gather this kind of information because they wanted to know who they were. And this resulted in the killing of more like 50,000 people. And I always wonder that with these new thinkings that we have of sometimes breaking into secure messaging or limiting secure messaging or not having privacy properties in secure messaging, does this mean that if again something like this comes, it will be much more worse than what is in the past? In the past, it was already horrible, but maybe in the future it will allow this kind of those kind of abilities to break secure messaging, or we limit it to only be certain specific kind of properties. Maybe we're opening the door for certain kind of these to happen again. So, and with this, if you want to read more about any privacy laws, the kind of surveillance that happens nowadays, cohesion to specifically to minorities and LGBTQIA+ groups and women, here's a lot of links that you can access. Some of them are in Spanish or Portuguese because I like to also see other parts, other regions of the world. But if you're interested, I'm sure you can always translate it somehow. And with that, thank you very much. I'll stop sharing. And any question?
Thank you, Sophia, for this talk. Are there any questions? So if you have questions, please put them in the chat. Douglas, do you want to unmute yourself?
Thanks. Yeah, thanks very much, Sophia, for a wonderful talk. I was wondering what you think about the phrase end-to-end security in the context of applications that are explicitly designed to allow users to send a copy of the message somewhere else. And I think like there's an example of, I think maybe WhatsApp in the news recently about concerns about being allowed to relay or report messages. And perhaps one could view the Apple parental reporting on children's phones as another example of that. So do you think that violates the meaning of end-to-end security? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this has been also in the news quite a lot of like, the way that I think about it from a theory perspective is that instead of having like only two participants, now you added like this reported participant to the conversation itself, right? And they are able to see the messages that got reported and targeted as abuse. I think that in theory, it's probably nice, and one say like maybe this is a way that we can actually diminish the abuse that is happening quite a lot in the digital world. But maybe in practicality, it's not so much so. When I was also reading about the Apple parental program, I never realized this because I'm not so much part of that community, but they were telling me that maybe this will be used by parents who don't want their children to be part of LGBTQIA+ groups. And if they somehow any kind of sexual image or any kind of different content of this gets triggered by the parental mechanism, then it will harm them more even in a sexual orientation way. And I never realized this. So it's really difficult to say a question of if indeed it still comes secure. In theory, it should be just as easy as adding someone, and this person should be objective enough to say like this indeed was abuse, and I'm not going to be taking these messages somewhere else and laughing about them or reporting somewhere else. But in theory, it's not so easy. But in practicality, it's not so easy to do so, because any human reporter that gets, or any bot that gets added into the conversation might come with their own subjective thinking, with their own, because what happens if the reporter is, for example, sees something of abuse, but it also infers because of the conversation that this person does certain kind of activity that they do not agree or discriminate them because of their age or because they are women, or like there's like a million of other things to think about it when we are actually trying to add like a reporter to a conversation. So it's not so simple as to just add it. So maybe it's not indeed anymore a security, it's just like a mechanism to try to patch the fact that we have too many reports of abuse and we don't know how to actually solve them. Maybe the correct way to solve them will be to actually change the way what we do in society, in which we will have to change the way in which we teach education, and in which we support the health system, the social services, and the law enforcement systems, so we don't have to again rely on technology that is going to be breaking into encryption in order to patch all of this that is more like a social problem. But well, I ranted a lot. That's the kind of answer. It's a difficult question.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. I mean, I guess the motivation was like, if an endpoint of the conversation decides to, share their messages, like that's nothing that cryptography could ever defend against. And so from a formal perspective, it doesn't feel like a security violation, but certainly there are, societal and cultural implications of that. And so thanks for the answer.
Yeah. Welcome.
Are there any further questions? So while people might think about questions, I've got one question. I'm not sure if we ever discussed this. So there's this standpoint about deniability, that it only serves the powerful, because let's say if you are an oppositional and the police catches you with a chat on your phone, then the judge will believe the police. They don't care if this is actually could be faked. But if you're a person of power, then you can say, look, there's no proof about this, and you might be believed.
Yeah, exactly. I also think something similar, because what happens nowadays is that most of the time plain text evidence is accepted as evidence in certain cases, not in all cases, but in most of the cases it will be accepted as evidence if there's a way, for example, saying, oh, but indeed it was found in the device of the user, or we know that this is the username that this person always uses, so for sure we know that this is the chat. And that's kind of the justification when this doesn't actually provide a strong cryptographic proof of authentication. And in that way, I also agree that if you are like a person who just happily is crossing a border and your device gets seized, and that device also provides, the protocol that you are using provides deniability in itself, it will not mean a lot, because in the curve maybe we'll say, yeah, but no one understands about this deniability proof, so why should we care that you're saying that indeed you have deniability? But if you're a person of power, you will have access to more well-known lawyers who will be able to maybe explain this in a better terms. And then indeed, deniability gets only used by the powerful ones who have access to the resources of someone who can actually explain this in better terms. But with all of the technology that we sometimes have put in the legal system, I think at the beginning it was also like that. At least what I read that's kind of similar was with DNA analysis. that at the beginning in certain trials, it was always deemed that it was like, no, how is it that like a hair of my head actually identifies me as a person? That's absurd. There's no scientific evidence, when there was like a mountain of scientific evidence, but a lot of people disregarded it as something bad, until eventually in a lot of court of laws, in a lot of cases, it eventually got understood and eventually it was used. So it just needs to create historical precedents, and then indeed can be used in certain specific cases, but we will need to do the historical precedents in order to arrive to that. And very interesting case of the DNA thing is experiences what happened between O.J. Simpson and the people, which indeed they had certain kind of DNA evidence, but it was deemed as too ridiculous to be part of the trial. Even nowadays, we know that indeed it provides actual identity of the person.
Yeah.
So it's a difficult question also. It's something that I've been thinking, and I was thinking recently more about deniability in the sense that I said that by using, for example, explicit proof of authentication, maybe then you can always say, you can attest the identity of a participant, and you can say, oh, I know that this person is not trying to impersonate me because I know these 5 other people can attest to the identity of this participant. Kind of the same, for example, what happens with servers with these certificates, that you will have like at least this chain that you can attest for the identity. And in that case, maybe it was useful that someone else can publicly verify that indeed it was the participant who was supposed to be talking to.
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole different dimension, right? So if you look into group chats, then if there are 10 people that say, yes, this was this person, then.
Yeah.
Are there any further questions from the audience? Okay, at least in Europe, it's already quite late. I can imagine that people are slowly getting tired and don't come up with too many questions. So thank you a lot again for giving this talk. And then now we are actually ending this part of the conference and have a social meeting on Wonder. And I will repost the Wonder link. I know we send it around. So I will stop the recording